Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. If you follow me on Instagram, you might know that I recently went to Scranton, Pennsylvania to attend a friend's wedding. And as often happens, I did a bit of research about Scranton before the trip. I got really interested, and now, of course, I want to do a few episodes about it. And, if you are one of those people who follow me and saw me posting about Scranton, you might have noticed that on the first day I was there, I was posting a lot about it, and then I got real quiet, and there was a reason for that. And that's because things got a little bit weird while I was there, in a paranormal way. The trip in general didn't exactly turn out how I thought it would. Not exactly in a terrible way, but just in an unexpected way. So when I first planned this trip to Scranton, I was excited because it's a city with multiple train museums and it's famously haunted. And I had all these plans about what I was going to do and where I was going to go in the couple of days I was going to be there. And also, I just love a city that was once more prosperous than it is now and has kind of had a fall from glory and is full of the ruins of a better or more prosperous past. It's not that I like to see places fall upon hard times. I just think it's a really interesting view into a part of history that often gets forgotten. And if this is a topic that interests you, you can also check out the episodes I did last year about Beacon, New York for more of that vibe. But like I said, in Scranton, all of my plans got derailed. And the first night I was there, I found myself in probably the most frightening paranormal experience that I have had so far. Before the trip, I had an initial moment of disappointment because I waited until the last minute to book my travel, and the hotel block that had been reserved for the wedding, which happened to be at the most famously haunted hotel in Scranton, was totally full. And I was bummed at missing the chance to stay at this haunted hotel that also used to be a train station. Two things I love, ghosts and trains. But apparently I had nothing to worry about because my Airbnb had plenty of creepy stuff waiting for me. And this is the first of 2 or probably 3 episodes that I'm going to do about haunted Scranton. So in this episode, I'm going to talk all about my own experiences, how the trip went, the weird paranormal stuff that I encountered. And then in the other episode or episodes, I will talk a little bit about some of the ghost stories about other locations in Scranton. But as always, before I get into my own experiences, I just want to give a really quick bit of background about Scranton, because especially if you live outside of the United States, you may not be familiar with Scranton, Pennsylvania. So if you live in the US, I think it is safe to say that you probably know Scranton from the US version of The Office. I know that The Office was an incredibly popular show here in the States, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, or who maybe lives elsewhere, The Office was a workplace comedy that was based in the regional sales office and admin office of a paper company. And a lot of the show is about the drudgery of work and good and bad coworkers. And it kind of gets more silly and sitcom-y as the seasons go on. But one really crucial part of the show is the location where it is set, which is Scranton. In the show, Scranton is made out to be this kind of depressing place to live. It's the sort of place that the characters seem to feel stuck in or want to escape from. And there's a lot of local color in the show. So for example, in the opening credits, you see the Penn Paper Building in Scranton, which is a real building that houses a real paper company. And there's one episode that has a Scranton rap where they call out some of the sites that you can see in Scranton, including the Anthracite Museum, because coal mining was very big there. So I kind of feel like in the US, Scranton is almost like a joke because it is so closely tied to The Office in at least the pop culture imagination. And The Office doesn't exactly make it seem like a great place to be, and often Scranton is just a punchline. And I saw that even in my interactions with people before the trip where I mentioned to people I have an upcoming trip to Scranton coming up, and people were kind of like, why are you going to Scranton? It's just that kind of place. And I feel like it's a little bit unusual for a place to be so well known, but also to be seen as kind of a backwater. While The Office makes Scranton look like just a depressing suburb, Scranton actually has a really interesting history, and I feel like it's been unfairly maligned at least based on the research that I have done. In the 19th century, the area was very prosperous because of coal mining and the train industry, because I think there was a lot of iron ore that you could make train tracks out of, that sort of thing. A lot of industrial stuff. And Scranton is actually nicknamed the Electric City because it had the first electrified streetcar trolleys in the United States. It was a place with a lot of industry and technological progress, I guess you would say. A lot of 19th century tech. So it was a large and prosperous city. By 1900, Scranton had about 100,000 people living there, and it was the third largest city in Pennsylvania and the 38th largest city in the US. And I think that the height of Scranton's population was around 1920, when 137,000 people lived there. For contrast, 76,000 people lived in Scranton in 2020. So that's like half as many people as there had been 100 years before in 1920. Scranton's story is similar to the story of many cities and towns in the United States that were big industrial hubs, and then work dwindled and jobs went away and people moved out and things just sort of slipped into disarray and depression, that sort of thing. Sort of that Rust Belt story. And Scranton is really interesting because it still has all these beautiful buildings and landmarks, but other aspects, perhaps the more practical and logistical aspects of its glory days, have been dismantled. For example, despite Scranton being a place known for its trains and trolleys, there are no longer any trolleys there, and there isn't even a train that goes from Scranton to New York City anymore. Even though I think it would only be a couple-hour train ride, maybe 2 to 3 hours, so many of the things that Scranton was famous for have been basically mothballed or totally removed. And I think the train is a great example of that. So for people like me who don't drive, you either have to take an unreliable bus to Scranton, which had very bad reviews, or do what I did, which was absurd, which was to fly to Scranton. Scranton is only 100 miles away from New York City, so it is a 23-minute plane ride. The airplane, which held 50 people, was so small that it wasn't even pulled up to the regular gate at Newark, so we had to take a shuttle bus to get from the gate to like the back lot where this airplane was being kept. At least it felt like a back lot. It was kind of far. And the process of taking the shuttle bus to the airplane from the gate took longer than the actual airtime of the flight. And, you know, there's a lot to be said here about the inefficiency of air travel compared to train travel for short distances like this, because, 50 people, that's like less than one train car worth of people. But they had to fly us out in an airplane? Just ridiculous. It's almost like someone sat down and was like, how can we cut off this city that was once extremely connected to things and just make it really difficult to come here and make this once prosperous place kind of feel like a backwater? I know that's not really how it works, but it is a pity how public transportation is much less comprehensive than it used to be. Again, see also my episode about Mount Beacon, where I talk about a lost tourist railway. Also, one tangentially related thing that also foiled a little bit some of my Scranton plans was that I had planned to walk around several different parts of Scranton and walk from, one neighborhood to another, etc. And I'd had my routes planned that I was going to walk, and I knew how long it was going to take. But when I got there, I discovered something that was truly baffling to me, which is that there are not a lot of sidewalks in some parts of Scranton. There seem to be sidewalks downtown, but at some point they just disappear. And there were stretches of road that had crossing signs and walk signs, at the intersections, but there was no sidewalk connecting these street corners together. So there were moments, especially on my first day there, when I found myself walking along the side of a road on what I thought was a sidewalk, and then I realized it was actually just a shoulder of a road, and then the shoulder went away, and then I had to stop walking, and I found myself just standing in a stranger's driveway with no way of continuing on my walk. And I just had to, call a lift to pick me up from the side of the road. So, if you, like me, do not drive, I guess don't assume that every city or suburb has sidewalks. But it almost feels like there used to be sidewalks there because there were the pedestrian lights for crossing intersections. But maybe the sidewalks went the way of the train and were removed at some point. But it just feels like another example of Scranton's baffling transportation infrastructure, especially in a place that was known for transportation infrastructure. I feel like that's a pretty good metaphor for some stuff. It kind of makes me think of that saying, they roll up the sidewalks at 9 p.m. or whatever. I'm not sure if that's a regional saying or not, but, this idea of like a town that usually it's closes at a certain time of night. Usually it's a small town thing, whatever, or a suburban thing. But in this case, it's literally like they rolled up the sidewalks. They were like, we're just done. Scranton isn't what it used to be. No need to walk around. And I will also say it was wild because I know walking along the side of the road sounds very unsafe, but there was like almost no traffic anywhere in Scranton. There were, of course, cars driving by, but on the second day I was there was a day where I was walking to an area with some hiking and stuff, and there was no sidewalk, and I walked along this road for, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and I didn't see a single car the whole time. So in that case, it was fine. It really did seem strangely sleepy for a city that, of course, isn't as big as it once was, but, almost 80,000 people, that's not nobody. So anyway, the paranormal thing that happened to me happened on my first night there, so I should walk through how that day was, because I do think that looking at your own emotional state, energy levels, etc., leading up to a paranormal experience is perhaps illuminating and useful, and I do try to share that information for folks so they can see if there are similar patterns in their own paranormal experiences. But this was what my first day looked like. So even though it was only a 23-minute plane ride to Scranton, it still took me hours to get to Newark in New Jersey, where the plane left from where I live in Queens. And I spent a decent amount of time waiting at the airport for the flight. And Newark is a truly awful airport. I swear it gets worse every time I go there. It was loud, everything was under construction, there were huge crowds. My gate wasn't even a real gate. It was a sensory nightmare. And yeah, it just felt worse than it had last time. So anyway, by the time I landed in Scranton, or Wilkes-Barre, I suppose that's where the airport is, I was not in amazing shape. I've mentioned this before in the podcast, but I'm not neurotypical, and sometimes when I am particularly exhausted and have been exposed to overwhelming sensory stuff, I just end up in, pretty bad shape. And I had a few hours to kill before I could check into my Airbnb, so I walked around a couple different parks, including Nayog Park, which I'll talk about in the next episode. And I don't think I realized how out of it I was until I got to the Airbnb, once I was able to check in. And I found myself spending a sort of long time sitting in a dark room in complete silence staring at the wall, which is usually a sign that I have been overstimulated. So eventually, after some period of time, I was in good enough shape to, turn on some music and play a couple games of solitaire, because I always like to travel with a deck of cards, and kind of settle into the Airbnb. So that's where my mental state was that evening. Not amazing, but it could have been much worse. So now I should tell you about this Airbnb. With the hotels in the area mostly booked, I didn't have a ton of options when it came to lodging. As far as I can tell, it seems like very few tourists go to Scranton. I was surprised to find that everyone I encountered while I was out and about thought I was from there. Lyft drivers were asking me for directions, or asking me like, oh, do you prefer going this way or that way? People in the parks were asking me for directions, and this made a pretty big contrast to what it's like when I visit the suburban Texas town that I grew up in, which is about the same size as Scranton, where everyone immediately makes it pretty obvious that they know I'm from out of town. Like, as soon as they see me, people at stores, people out and about, it's not that people are always unfriendly, though occasionally people are a little bit rude. But, I have a buzz cut, I dress all in black, I have a bunch of tattoos. I often stand out, not in a major city, let's say. But even though I didn't see anyone else who looked remotely like me in Scranton, the automatic assumption that everyone had was that I was from there, which was actually kind of nice. And, everyone I encountered was nice, like friendly in a Pennsylvania way, like not super warm, but not cold, and they would like talk to me and stuff, which I find is how it is when I go to Philly as well. But I think it just speaks to how there's this assumption that no one from out of town would go to Scranton, which is not at all the assumption in the suburb of Dallas that I grew up in, which is just really interesting to me. It's a really, really different mindset, even though they're two similarly sized cities. But to get back to where I was staying, there weren't a ton of options, but this place looked nice enough. And it was, to be clear, it was a nice apartment. And for the most part, it was a perfectly pleasant place to stay. I would not tell someone not to stay there unless they are a light sleeper because the radiator was very loud. It was about a 100-year-old building. It was an attic apartment, so that added a little bit to the creepy ambiance, perhaps. It had the slanted sides to the walls. But it was nice. It was a nice place. But one of the weirdest things about this Airbnb was that it was located on a street that was named after running water. I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to give away the location of this Airbnb, but I was very surprised to see when I got out of the lift to go into the Airbnb that the reason why the street was named after running water was because there was a small creek running along the side of the road in between the street and the sidewalk. I've never seen that in like a residential neighborhood. So basically to get from the street to the house, you have to cross a small bit of running water. It was like a little creek, and in between the driveways, it was running through stones, and then it would run through like a pipe or like a tube underneath every driveway. So cross that running water to get there. And I didn't think about that from a paranormal perspective until much later after I was already home and was like, there are a lot of stories about people having paranormal experiences around running water. And there's something very symbolic about stepping over a small creek in order to get to a building, especially since this building ended up being haunted. It's almost like a crossing of the Rubicon or something. There's something significant about that, or at least it feels that way. So here I am, staying alone in an attic apartment next to some running water, feeling somewhat exhausted, pretty drained. And I go to sleep around 10 p.m., but as I'm going to bed, I get this really weird feeling about the right side of the room, this corner of the room next to one of the closets. There were two closets, one on either side of the room. And this area was kind of in between this closet and the bed. And it's also worth noting that the part of the room that I felt bad about was on the opposite side of the room from the radiator. So it was pretty far away from the radiator. And I can't really describe the feeling I got except that it was a bad vibe. And it actually caused me a little bit of stress when I was trying to go to sleep, because I'm one of those people who always likes to sleep facing towards the door. But if I faced towards the door, I would have to turn my back to this area on the other side of the room that I did not feel good about. And I really had a lot of trouble deciding which way to lay as I was trying to fall asleep. And finally, I decided to face towards the door because that's what I always do. But I just kept thinking about this other corner of the room, and I just did not feel good having my back to it. So I went to sleep. And I woke up again maybe around 11:30 or so because the radiator was banging. Like I said, this was an older building. It was built about 100 years ago. So it has those trademark noisy radiators. But I will say that I have never been somewhere with radiators that were quite that loud. Some of the Fordham University radiators in the dorms I lived in gave it a run for its money, but I still think this Airbnb has Fordham beat. And I'm used to banging radiators because I live in a building that is about 100 years old and has noisy radiators, as you sometimes hear on my recordings during the winter. But as I was lying awake, I got this feeling that was very similar to the feeling that I got when I was staying in Salem at the haunted Hawthorne Hotel. And I think I talked about this during the episodes that I did about the Hawthorne Hotel, but it was this sense that someone was in the room with me, or maybe something was in the room with me. But as long as I didn't open my eyes and look around to find it, I would be okay, and it couldn't get me. Highly irrational, but it's a strong feeling that I had. I had my phone and headphones next to me in bed, so really quickly, without looking around at all, I put on my headphones so that I would have something to block out the noise, and, I just had this really uneasy feeling. I needed to feel comforted, so I put on the most comforting album that I could think of, which, if you're curious, is Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92 by Aphex Twin. So I put that album on repeat, I closed my eyes again, and I kind of drifted in and out of sleep. But eventually, even with my headphones in, I woke up again because I heard this weird noise. And this is a weird way to describe it, but this is the only way I can think of describing it. It was like someone shifting around on a leather couch. You know that almost squeaking sound you get when your bare legs move on a leather couch? It's like a squeak, but it's kind of low. But this was really loud, like much louder than, sitting on a leather couch. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. And it was dark, so I couldn't see anything around me, and I couldn't move at all. My body felt really heavy. I tried to lift my arms for, maybe a few minutes, but I could not. And the noise was, of course, coming from the right side of the bed, from an area in front of one of the two closet doors, that area that I had felt uneasy about earlier. It wasn't right next to the bed. I'd say it was like a few feet away from the foot of the bed, if that makes sense. Kind of like right by the corner of the foot of the bed. But I really felt like there was something there in that corner of the room. It felt like something or someone was in the room with me. But eventually, after a couple minutes, I felt like the thing either left or backed off a little bit, and I was able to move again, and I turned on the light. And that's when I realized that I had had my first experience of sleep paralysis. It's funny because maybe a week before the Scranton trip, I was talking to Finn from the podcast Follow the Woo, which you should listen to. It's a great podcast. And Finn asked me if I had ever experienced sleep paralysis, and I was like, nope, never had it. I've always been very glad to have never experienced sleep paralysis. Perhaps I was being a little bit too cocky when I was like, nope, I'm not a sleep paralysis person. So much for that. I guess you should, not be too cocky about these sorts of things. So anyway, at this point, I think it was maybe around midnight. I did take some notes during the night about the timeline of events, but the notes don't really make a lot of sense to me. But I know that at this point I was up. It was still pretty early in the night, and I tried to get to sleep, and I just couldn't. I did have the light on at this point, and I kept it on for the rest of the night. And for the most part, I am a pretty good sleeper most of the time. If I wake up during the night on a regular basis, it's always between the hours of 3 and 5 a.m. I know that correlates to the lungs and the body clock, so I assume it has something to do with my asthma or allergies. So it was very unusual for me to wake up that early in the night, and I thought I would have no trouble getting back to sleep, but I was wrong. I tried really hard to get back to sleep. I did all my usual things, did some meditation, no dice. And it's safe to say that I was feeling pretty scared, perhaps irrationally so. And that is also a somewhat unusual experience for me. I felt almost like whatever presence had been in the room, it had backed off, but it wasn't totally gone. I felt like it was still there watching me. Who knows? Maybe from inside the closet. Though I didn't think of that at the time. But it did feel like I had kind of just stepped just barely out of the room, but not really. And it was just waiting to see what I was going to do, or so it felt like to me. I felt uneasy enough that I put off getting out of bed and walking across the apartment to use the restroom because I didn't even want to risk turning my back on it as I got out of bed. So finally I gave up on trying to sleep and I just started reading because a lot of the time I fall asleep while reading. And just as I was finishing my book around 5 a.m., so I'd been up basically the entire night, I finally started dozing off. And I was so relieved that I was finally going to get to sleep a little bit before the day started. But just as my eyes were fluttering closed, I heard a voice. And I would describe it as a mechanical voice, almost like someone speaking through a vocoder, very faintly, or some other weird mechanical voice, through a spirit box. Though, of course, I was not using a spirit box or anything. I didn't have music on, etc. And the sound seemed to come right from the place that I felt uneasy about. So again, not at all near the radiator or the pipes for the radiator, the other part of the room. And I've talked about this before, but I have auditory processing issues, so a lot of the time I hear something, and when I initially hear it, I've misheard it, and then a few seconds later, often 10 seconds or so later, I understand what was really said, which is a lot of fun because when I have conversations with people, they say something, I ask them, what was that? And then as they start to say it again, I'm like, oh, got it. Which I'm sure is very confusing for people. But I'm just pretty slow to process things. So initially I thought the voice said, so are we. But then once my brain got a chance to catch up to my ears, I felt that it had very clearly said, go away. And again, throughout all of this, I didn't see anything visually in that corner. Though, of course, when I had the sleep paralysis, I wasn't able to see anything because it was too dark and I couldn't move. but I definitely got the sense that something was there that I just couldn't see and that it had been speaking to me. So, of course, having heard "go away" just as I was trying to go to sleep, I was wide awake again, which I was not happy about. And I was up until the sun came up. And then once the sun rose, I was able to doze off for a little bit, not very long, maybe an hour, hour and a half. And once it was light again in the apartment, it felt fine. Like, that's why I was able to fall asleep again. And I had noticed that when I got there initially, during the daylight hours, it had seemed fine. And then a little bit after it got dark, I started to feel not so good. So that was my first night in Scranton, the first of 2 nights. And I was definitely dreading the next night for sure. But first I had to get through this day on very little sleep. And I don't know how I managed to be like chronically sleep deprived when I was younger, because I can't do it at all now. I guess I'm in my 30s. Can't run on no sleep. I was not happy. And I had planned to do some things in Scranton. I wanted to check out the train museum thingy and the trolley museum and walk around the downtown area of Scranton and see some of the cool buildings, but I just couldn't. I ended up going for a walk over by Lake Scranton, and then I just rested until my friend's wedding, which was lovely, by the way, and absolutely worth the trip. So then after the wedding, I get back to the apartment and I'm just completely exhausted. I just wanted to sleep. So I thought, okay, what can I do in order to deal with this issue? Because as much as I always think I want to encounter the paranormal, I don't want to at the expense of a good night's sleep. I draw the line at being uncomfortable. That's why I won't say never, but it would take a lot to get me out to do an overnight investigation or something. I just need to have my routine and my schedule, and I do not like getting off my sleep schedule. And, also, I don't really want to encounter the paranormal when it's really scary and I'm alone. And I guess it is worth saying, like, I can't think of the last time I've slept in a room alone. So that could have contributed as well to my discomfort at, like, being in that room. But I don't think it was just that. So anyway, on the second night, before I went to bed, I did 2 things. And I was like, one or both of these things is going to work. So first, I appealed to the Virgin Mary for protection. I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, but I definitely still have a lot of faith in, let's call it, the Catholic pantheon, in particular in the Virgin Mary, who I've been told via dreams that I should appeal to if I ever need help or psychic protection, etc. So that is something that I do. And I think the night before, when I had been awake and freaked out, I was just too out of it to think to do this. But it's really what I should have done in the first place. I'm always a little bit cagey about talking about this sort of religious side of things, but I also feel like I can't tell the story honestly without mentioning this, and it also doesn't really feel right for me to not give her credit in this, so that was the first thing that I did. And then after that, I just had a conversation with any entity that might be present in the room. A one-sided conversation, of course, but I basically explained that I wanted to communicate, and then I apologized if I may have accidentally offended this entity, and I explained that I didn't mean any disrespect, and I was only staying there for a couple days, and I said that I would be checking out by 11 a.m. the next morning, and they would not have to deal with me anymore after that. And I just asked that this entity let me have a good night's sleep. I explained that I was just really, really tired, and I just wanted to sleep, and, that I thanked anything present listening to me, and I went to bed. And even though the radiator was still extremely loud, so loud that I had to put in my headphones and put on a podcast in order for me to go to sleep at all. Oh, and also the landlord's dog was barking continually until at least 11 p.m. when I finally fell asleep, despite the racket. And thankfully, I fell asleep and I stayed asleep. I also left the light on all night, but I was able to sleep totally fine despite that. I didn't wake up even once throughout the entire night, even though I'm sure the radiator was still being very loud, and I slept really well. I didn't get a bad vibe as I was drifting off to sleep, or when I woke up, or anything. It just felt like a totally normal room, and it felt like a completely different room than the one I had spent the previous night in. So I don't know which of the 2 things that I did worked the most, or if just doing both those things together was what was so effective, but I guess somebody was listening to me, and I was very grateful for that. Oh, it's also worth mentioning that I did try to do the Tower of Light method of psychic self-defense the first night. I've talked about it before, and I've had a lot of luck with that, working with people. Like, I use a version of the Tower of Light usually when someone walks up to me on the street and I don't want to talk to them. And I've had people literally turn around and walk away. Like, it does seem to be pretty protective psychically in that way. But I found it pretty ineffective in this instance, or at least I think it was ineffective. Who knows, maybe I would have felt worse if I hadn't done it. But I found that I had a lot of trouble focusing on the visualization for the Tower of Light when I was in that space on the first night and feeling so uncomfortable. And I don't usually have problems with visualizations, so it just felt like something was off there, and that feels worth mentioning. And that was my paranormal experience in Scranton. I guess to put a bow on it, I'll talk about how the rest of my trip went. The next day I checked out of the Airbnb. I killed a little bit of time at Naog Park, the park that I'd spent some time in when I first got there, which is supposedly haunted and which I'll talk about next time. It's a really cool park with a tree house and a covered bridge and a waterfall and all kinds of cool stuff. And it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who also designed Central Park. So that's a really nice place to spend some time. Then I went to the airport, and I can say that the Wilkes-Barre Airport is the polar opposite of Newark. I think it had maybe 8 flights leaving the whole day, and they were just quietly playing 80s music over the speakers. There were no loud TVs or crowds of people. And then some volunteers came by with therapy dogs to cheer people up because the airport sucks. And I was like, wow, I can't imagine this being any more different from Newark. So my trip back to New York was a lot better than my trip out because I had the good fortune of waiting in an incredibly pleasant airport. So hats off to the Wilkes-Barre Airport, I guess. And that was my Scranton trip. It was a pretty quick turnaround, just a couple of days, and I had planned out a whole itinerary for myself that I really deviated from, much like the scripts that I write for myself on this podcast, I love to make a plan and then do none of the things that I plan to do. But now, it's about a week later. Actually, yeah, I got home exactly 1 week ago, as of the day I'm recording this, and I'm glad the trip turned out the way it did. I think I was overly ambitious with my plans in the first place, but also the paranormal aspect of this is just also interesting to me, and more interesting to me than I think a museum might have been. Though who knows? I do like trolleys. And as I'll talk about in a future episode, one of the trolleys at the Trolley Museum is supposedly haunted. So I guess I did miss out on the haunted trolley. But, I still can't get over the fact that this attic apartment that I was staying in could only be reached by crossing over running water, for example. The trip was just weird in a really fun way, and I can say I have very fond feelings towards Scranton now, I know it's not exactly easy to get there, and perhaps there's more to do in some other cities, but like I said, it feels a little unfairly maligned to me. And while I'm not exactly happy to have experienced my first sleep paralysis, hopefully my only one, I can say that it was a unique experience that I hope will not be repeated, but that was eye-opening, I guess. And now, when people ask me if I have experienced sleep paralysis, I can say, yeah, I have. So anyway, like I mentioned before, in my usual form, I thought this was going to be 1 episode, and then I was like, okay, I can cover Scranton in 2 episodes though, but I think this is going to be 3 episodes, just because Scranton is such an interesting place, and I really enjoyed being there and doing the research for my trip. And again, I love a place that's kind of fallen from its prior glory, but which holds so much history and tells us so much about a certain point in the not so distant past. So in the next episode, I'm going to talk about some of the famously haunted places in Scranton. Like I said, I only went to a couple of them, but my general feeling about Scranton is that it is probably way more haunted than anyone gives it credit for. Even if you don't believe in ghosts and the paranormal, I think it's hard to argue that Scranton is not haunted by its past, because you can't walk around or take a lift around Scranton without seeing these beautiful buildings and these beautiful parks and getting this sense that things were once very different. And if that's not being haunted, I don't know what is. That being said, I also think it's haunted by many ghosts, so I can only assume that my experience is representative of the general vibe in Scranton, though who knows, I was only there a couple days. So, tune in next time for more Scranton. Also, I apologize if there was more road noise than usual this episode. I usually record on Monday nights, but I wanted to get a little bit ahead of things this week because I'm doing some more travel this week. So I foolishly decided to record on Sunday afternoon when all of the Sunday drivers are out in Queens and honking and angry at each other and riding loud motorcycles. So there may have been a little bit more noise than usual. I'll try my best to get some of it out. But truly, it's been one of those days where, people will just lean on their horn for a good 30 seconds. But that's just the vibe today, I guess. Anyway, if you want to check out the show notes, they are at buriedsequencepodcast.com. I didn't really use that many sources for this episode because it was mostly about my own experiences, but I'll include any sources that I did use. You can follow me on Instagram at buriedsequencepodcast. You can write to me at buriedsequencepodcast@gmail.com. And if you like this podcast, please rate and review it. Please tell your friends about it. And thanks so much for listening.